Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are, and welcome to this Advanced Visualforce webinar. My name's Paul Batterson. I'll be your speaker today. I'm a technical architect at Mavens Consulting, who are a healthcare and life sciences implementation partner for Salesforce. I'm also a Summer 14 Force.com MVP. You can see a picture of me speaking here at Dreamforce this year, and if you want to find out any more about me, you can follow me on Twitter. There's my Twitter handle @pbatterson. Some of you may or may not recognize my voice. I also run the Force.comcast video series, so obviously do the voiceover for that. If you've not heard of Force.comcast, it's a weekly developer tips and tricks video set. Every week a video is posted for free, which you can view on YouTube. There's the link to the YouTube playlist there, and there's the Twitter handle for that, and we cover different areas of Salesforce development, going through different pieces of functionality. And quite pertinent to this conversation at the moment, the current series we're going through is creating a wizard system and a stateful controller system using JSON, which might be of interest to you. Before we can get started, we have to have the Salesforce Safe Harbor statement. So Salesforce is a publicly traded company. I am not an employee of Salesforce, but if anything is said here that is future forward-looking, please make any purchasing decisions based upon existing functionality. This webinar is being recorded. You'll be sent a link to the recording in a week or two after today. If you want to be social, please go on and engage with Salesforce developers, either via the Twitter handles or the Twitter hashtag, or through any of the other channels that are listed here. If you have any questions, we have a fantastic team of developer evangelists ready and waiting on the side to answer your questions. They can help out with any questions that you have as we go through. Please obviously respect the etiquette for the Q&A. I'll be doing a live Q&A session at the end for any further questions. And obviously if you have anything else, you can head to the developer forums for some follow-up. So let's first of all go through today's agenda. So this webinar is going to be largely focused around improving performance for your Visualforce pages. So we're going to set some baselines and some assumptions of what you might want to know before we get started. We're going to quickly dive into looking at the three different areas that can affect your page performance. First of which is Viewstate. Second is some Apex code. And the third we'll briefly touch upon is using resources, so images, JavaScript, CSS. We're going to go through what the problems could be from these areas, and then we're going to go through some tips on how you can improve your Visualforce pages to have them run faster for yourself and your customers, and how you can generally improve your page speed and performance. We're then going to wrap this off at the end by having a look at an asynchronous page and how you can use asynchronous pages to create nice single-page applications that will not only be far more responsive for your customers, but might be easier to maintain going forwards as well. So the other thing before we start is there are code snippets. As part of this, when you get the recording, you'll be able to see all the code snippets. And in that recording follow-up, there'll also be a link to a repository where everything's shared anyway. In terms of some assumptions, so this webinar assumes you are comfortable with Visualforce and you are comfortable with Apex. We're not going to spend a lot of time going into line-by-line details of how pieces work. We're going to kind of run through things quite quickly because there's a lot of good content to cover today. So yeah, if you're not very comfortable with either of those, you might want to go away, have a go through some of the developer workbooks, and then follow up with this webinar again afterwards. So let's dive straight in and start talking about page performance. So the first thing we're going to discuss is the view state. So what is the view state? Whenever you have a form on a page, your page is required to talk to your controller in the background. And this is part of the get and post back request cycle. So whenever you add an Apex form, you need some way of having that form data sent back to the controller on the server for it to reinstantiate and know what position it was in and what state it was in, and it to then be able to respond correctly. So whenever you add an Apex form, you get a hidden input field on the page that contains a lot of data. It's fully encrypted, so it can't be read and snooped by anyone to find out any information. But effectively, this little input field on the page tracks the state of the Visualforce page and the Apex controller in between these different server requests. The simple way of thinking about it, and the way that I like to always remind myself of what it is that within our model view controller, our MVC setup, the view state is the state of our current view part. So it's quite simple to think about what it is and what it's doing. What's probably less obvious is what it actually tracks. So whenever we have a controller, we have some data in there that's non-transient. This is data that we want to use between multiple requests. So say we're working on with a wizard for an account where what we're doing is we're just adding different pieces of information to the account as we go through in a step-by-step process. Well, we want to have that account data being shared across the requests, so that every time we move in between the different pages, the account data is still there so that we can keep on updating it properly. So that's an example of non-transient data, and that data is stored as part of the view state. Any extra objects or pieces of information that are reachable from this non-transient data in the controller and the controller extensions are also included. So, whenever you're architecting your pages and you're architecting your controllers, you have to be aware of not only what information is within the controller, but also what objects and information are also accessible and reachable from these parts, as they'll be included within the view state as well. The other really large part that comes down in the view state is the component tree. So the more components and the more complicated the components you have on your page, the more view state will be taken up for those components. So the view state itself contains a breakdown of the entire component tree and effectively the DOM component tree for that page and the associated state that goes with those components. So that what the system can do is whenever you have this request cycle, it can go in and it can recreate the page in the correct format for you every time. There's also a small amount of housekeeping data that Visualforce uses just to kind of keep things tidy, help it keep on running as it goes through. So what fields will actually actively add to the view state and require you to kind of have a view state present? Well, any input field, so any field that has an Apex input tag, any field, any command link or command button, so any action that goes on in the background, any Apex action tag that adds action functions, action support, any select tags, so select options are a great example, and the inline edit support tag. All of these will contribute to your view state and will be added in and will require a view state to be used on your page within the Apex form. So how does the request lifecycle work? So the way a web page works and the way that the internet works, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of, is that a user goes to a URL. They visit a URL and that sends a GET request to a server. The server then, in our case for an MVC architecture, will instantiate a controller and it will be instantiated on the server, and any constructor method will be run, and it'll create all of the state it needs. That state will then get serialized and encrypted to become the view state. So it gets stored and sent down as part of this hidden input field on the page. The page markup is then also sent down to the browser and is rendered, and this is then used to display your page. So from here you could go and you could click on, for example, another tab in Salesforce or another page, and you could go through that cycle again and again and again. What you could also do, however, is have your page be interactive. So it might be that on your page you have some input fields and you have a button that allows you to, save an account record, for example. When you press that button, a post request is sent to the server. So this is ever so slightly different. It's a different type of request. And in this request, what happens is that the server is called with this information. The view state is deserialized again. The method is run. The controller state is updated. And the view state is serialized again and sent back. And this is if you're just doing an on-page re-render. So many Visualforce pages that people write will just do a simple re-render where, for example, you change a select list option, and it will go away and change the values that are present on the page for you to select in another select list. So that little cycle there is how the view state is utilized. It's what the view state's really used for. It's to enable you, between these different requests, to have the same data be present in the controller and in the page. So we've kind of gone through now what the Viewstate is and how it works and how it's utilized. But what we really want to know now is why it's good for us and why it's bad for us. What are the performance implications of it? So the Viewstate is extremely helpful because it makes development easy. If you had to write a system that would track all the values of the fields for you and do it between requests and reinstantiate your controller, you'd have a lot of work to do. It would also likely not be as secure as the Viewstate is because it's got it's encrypted, it's gone through a series of rigorous tests. The Viewstate also allows you to do AJAX. So without having this Viewstate, you wouldn't be able to do these simple re-renders and simple AJAX requests that we're so used to doing, where you can re-render after an action is taken on a page. And as we mentioned, re-rendering is allowed. The problem with Viewstate is that it can be bulky. So rather than it always definitely is bulky, if you're not careful in how you use it, it can be. And this has a flip side limitation on that it is limited to 135K. So the fact that, 135K is not very much. It's not a grand amount of data. So there's not a lot you can fit in there. And so because it's already slightly bulky, filling up that limit is not very difficult. It also makes doing complicated AJAX quite complicated, really. If you want to do multiple different requests and re-renders, it can get very knotty, and realistically, it is impossible without a lot of rework. And the final thing that is always a slight thorn with it is that it's very difficult to understand where the bottlenecks are. So Salesforce has a fantastic Viewstate visualizer that we'll see in a minute. But the problem with it is that you can view what's in there, but it's often hard to know which data should and shouldn't be in the Viewstate, how you should and shouldn't be utilizing that data properly. So there's a few good points, but a few bad points that we have to weigh up. So we've discussed Viewstate, and typically whenever whenever page performance is discussed within Salesforce, it focuses largely on Viewstate, minimizing the Viewstate, lowering its size, and how you can use that to improve your page performance. Because not only is it quicker in just transferring data backwards and forwards, but if your Viewstate's smaller, it's quicker to recreate your controller and to deserialize it on the server. Another area that people often forget about, however, is your Apex. So if you've got a custom controller or a custom controller extension that is behind your page, and you're calling methods from that, those Apex methods can slow down your page dramatically. So let's go through some different parts of that. So to illustrate what I was just saying, let's pretend we've got a page where we have a retrieve contacts button. And funnily enough, we might see a few pages in a minute where we have a retrieve contacts button. I press that button, and what it's going to do is it's going to go away and retrieve a set of contacts for me related to a particular account. It's going to do a little Apex re-render, but what it's going to do for me is just go up, call an Apex function via this command button. That Apex function doesn't really show up here, but we can, it just does a query, really. Queries for the fact that there is some contacts on there and returns that list. That list then gets returned and our page re-renders for us. As we can see with a little clock symbol there, however long that Apex method takes to run, our page is waiting. So our user is therefore waiting. So everyone probably here uses a smartphone, uses a tablet, and people like responsive apps. They like things to be sharp, and snappy, and interactive. And all the while your user's waiting, they're not working with a responsive system. The fact is as well that Apex has a 10-second governor limit for execution. So if you use up all of that governor limit, which you're free to do, that's not a problem for you, you can actually have your user waiting 10 seconds before the page refreshes for them and re-renders. Even if you only take up half of that limit or a quarter of that limit, that is still 2 seconds that your user is sat there waiting for your page to load. And I can tell you that users generally aren't very pleased in having to wait too long. So how can we improve it? What are the areas that really slow us down? So the main areas of Apex that impact performance like this are expensive and long-running code. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean things like triggers and DML. slow queries. Slow queries can have a massive performance implication if you're not using the correct indexes, if you're not filtering properly, if you're retrieving more data than what you need. That can really slow down your system. We'll see in a second as well that not all of the ways in which looping is done in Apex is actually equal. So you can write your loops in different ways to make them run faster. And obviously, recursive loops are something that we should all avoid anyway. And running code synchronously, is something that is always a challenge. So there might be certain things that we're running synchronously that really should be done asynchronously. So for example, a call out to a web service, although we might want to do that in Apex because Apex has some great HTTP request classes that make it really easy to call out to a web service. That might slow us down if we're running it synchronously. It might be better to do that in a future method and get the result back later. So we've talked through Viewstate, we've talked through Apex and shown some areas there. The final thing we're going to discuss in page performance, which before we show you something interesting and exciting, which is how you can improve it, is resources. So pages nowadays contain a lot of JavaScript, a lot of CSS, and a lot of images. That's because pages need to be functionality rich. They need to be good looking, so we need to have some nice CSS on there. And images are always good for showing sprites, showing nice backgrounds and things like that. The way in which you serve your images should be done via static resources. Salesforce static resources make it really easy for you to work with images, work with CSS, and work with JavaScript in a consistent way. So you can bundle together all of your resources for your application into a single zip file, or you can even do it in multiple zip files if you feel that you want to separate out into the different areas, but one zip is normally best. And then you can put that up on Salesforce's servers, and it will be served to you via a content delivery network or a CDN. This means that whenever it comes down to your page, it will be lightning quick. CDN is a high bandwidth, low latency network that delivers your information down to you very, very rapidly. Salesforce also has caching in place so that your user doesn't have to download it multiple times, which again makes it much quicker for them. I've mentioned that you can obviously do bundling, but what's nice with this as well is you don't have to worry about doing cross-site requests with it. The CDN sits on the same Salesforce network and in the same domain as the normal Salesforce servers that you're using to render your pages, and so there's no cross-site worries. If you use your JavaScript, your CSS, and your images in line, well, you can do that, but it may come back to cause you problems. First of all, if you've never looked at the reasons why you should move JavaScript to the bottom of the page, if you've never looked at why you shouldn't have JavaScript running in files directly, it's because it's passed at runtime. So you should always consider at least moving it to the bottom of the page, like you'll see in a minute, for the example we've got. With CSS, you want to be able to share the CSS resources across multiple pages, because realistically, you're going to have one combined, unified look and feel for your application. If not, then you probably want to go away and rethink it anyway. So by putting these things into a single bundle, you can allow yourself to develop with them more effectively and reuse them. By having it on Salesforce's content delivery network rather than someone else's, you also have a bit more of a guarantee that it's going to stay up. So if you go away and run it on your own external server or have it on a different content delivery network, well, that's fine. But if that content delivery network goes down, your pages aren't going to look very good. You won't have your JavaScript. You'll lose your functionality. Or if someone else, for example, with jQuery, if the CDN you're using updates jQuery without kind of informing you, then it might break all your code. And as good as backward compatibility in something like jQuery is, it's never guaranteed. So you should always, wherever possible, store your JavaScript, your CSS, and your images within static resources. It's a great practice and one that I've seen in many, many different webinars and presentations that Salesforce give, and it's one I'm reiterating here. So we've seen the different areas that can cause problems. We've seen the Viewstate, we've seen the Apex problems, we've seen resources, and we've actually gone through the tip for managing resources, which is use static resources. So let's go through the different areas, different tips for improving our Viewstate and our Apex. So First thing we can do to improve our view state is to use the transient keyword. So the transient keyword can be applied to data members within the controller that we don't want to use across multiple requests. So we're going to see a page example in a minute where I have some data and there's a list of contacts that I'm going to display, but it depends on the account I've selected at the top. Every time I hit my retrieve contacts button that we saw earlier, I'm going to want to retrieve a new list of contacts, sorry. And so I don't want to be stood there, be storing that data. I want to be just retrieving it every time at runtime. So if you mark something as transient, it's only stored for the duration of that single page request and is not transmitted in the view state. And it's something you should be considerate of all the way through your development lifecycle. So it's not something you should look at too late. So wait until you've written your page and then decide to think about page performance. Something you should think of at the start is, can I mark this as transient? Do I need this going through? Because it's much easier to maintain your own mental workflow, mental state at the same time as well. So here's some code that we're going to go through. I mentioned that we've got a page. We've got a page called Advanced VF Pre-Transient, and that page has on it, we'll see it in a minute, it has an input box where we select an account, and we're just using the related account ID field on the contact just to allow us to select an account using a lookup filter. We've got an account, so we're actually retrieving that account and retrieving its details just to display. And we've got a list of contacts that we're going to display on the page. In the constructor, we just instantiate these, and then we've got a method here, which is going to re-render the page for us because it just returns null. And if we have an account ID, what we're going to do is retrieve the contacts and then retrieve a bunch of information around the account. Now, as I mentioned, I've got a single input field on there that allows me to select an account, and every time I hit the retrieve button, it's going to retrieve all this information for me. The contacts and the account information are updated. I don't need to store that between page requests because it's not needed. So I can improve my code by just making a couple of simple tweaks where I mark my account and my list of contacts as transient. A top tip I always use for helping me decide what things should be transient, normally, not always, but normally, they're things marked as private set. Something that you're not setting from the page, but are merely displaying and getting from the controller is normally a good piece of data to be marked as transient. Not always, but normally. So we've marked these as transient now, and so we're not going to be returning all that data. So what sort of implication does this have? Well, let's go and have a look. I'm going to be using the Viewstate development mode bar to be able to visualize this and show you live how the Viewstate changes. If you don't know how to turn this on, go into your user account on your developer org, and there's two checkboxes there, development mode and show Viewstate in development mode. Very easy for you to use. So here we are, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh this page because I've been online a while now, and good, it hasn't locked me out. So this is the famous pre-transient page that we've been discussing. And I have this lookup field here, and what I'm going to do is choose an account, which is Edge Communications, because they've got some contacts. I'm going to press my Retrieve Contacts button, and the page is going to re-render for me and retrieve all the information. So we can see here, it's got a bunch of information on the account, the same information we were looking at a second ago, and it's got a list of all the contacts. Nice and easy for us to display. If I go down onto the development mode bar here and hit the Viewstate button, you can see here that I can inspect my Viewstate and see what's in there. So first of all, the overall size of the Viewstate is 4.05 kilobytes. So we're quite a way off hitting our governor limit, but as I mentioned, it's something we should be aware of from the start. So let's make sure we're just being good developers and trying to have lean code all the way through. So if I keep on going through, I can see that I can look at my expressions, my internal pieces, my component trees only taking up 0.41 kilobytes. And if I have a look at what we've got from the controller here in the state, we've got the account, that's taking up 0.48 kilobytes, probably because we've got the description field in there. It's quite a large chunk of data. We've got the contact, well, that we need for the request. And then we've got our list of contacts, which is 0.67 kilobytes. and that's because we've got 7 records. So it's quite a bit of information we got there. Between those two, we've got over a kilobyte of our view state, which is about a quarter. So again, it's not a lot of data, not something we would need to worry about from a delivery perspective, but as good conscientious developers, we're going to worry about it and make sure we try and optimize from the start, because I may be working with an account now that has, I think, something like 7 contacts, but I could later on be working with an account that's going to retrieve for me 200, 300 contacts. And so something like this could have a massive impact. So let's switch over. Here we have another page, which is called Advanced Visualforce Post-Transient. And you will have no prizes for guessing that this uses the updated controller, or we've marked both items as transient. So if we now go in and select Edge Communications again, when we press to retrieve, goes away and loads. It's the same list, so we can check Rose, Sean, Peter, Christina, Bruce, Lex, and John. Rose, Sean, Peter, Christina, Bruce, Lex, and John. Fantastic. So Bruce Wayne has had a change of career and is now working for Edge Communications. If we open up the view state for this one now, we can see it's dropped to 3.16 kilobytes. And when we go in to inspect the controller again, we can see that we only have the initial contact on there, which is really good for us. We have some other data stored in there, which is probably just housekeeping data for the controller, but we don't have the main bulk we had before. So that shaved off roughly a kilobyte for us. So somewhere between 20 and 25% of our view states just disappeared. Now, as I mentioned, if I had if I had an account where there was 200, 300 contact records on there, or if I was retrieving contacts and opportunities and cases to display, obviously this would have a much bigger implication and a much bigger impact. So it's something you should be aware of as you're going through your development lifecycle and as you're writing your page controllers to think, could this be marked as transient? So let's continue on then. So we've gone through the view state. We've seen how you can use the transient variable to reduce the size of that. You can also make sure you have a small number of components. You can also try and make sure that you don't have multiple Apex form tags. There's other best practices out there that I encourage you to go out and read. There's lots of good blogs on the Developerforce website, the developer.salesforce.com website. The thing we're going to discuss now is queries. So whenever you have a query in an Apex method, even if it's in your controller constructor, you should try and ensure that it's lean and mean. You should ensure that your query returns the smallest amount of data possible for you to do your work. It shouldn't return too much. If you can, you should minimize the number of queries you have as well. So in the example previously, I had 2 queries, one for the account and one for the contacts list. Truth be told, I could do that in a single query. I should have probably done that in a single query. That would have been ever so slightly faster again, and it meant I would have only needed to mark the account as transient, and I could have got rid of that secondary variable, but what can you say, we all make mistakes. So make sure that your queries return the minimum amount of data required. Make sure that you have the smallest number of queries possible. When you're doing your queries, try and use index fields. So if you can, filtering upon an index field will be much, much quicker and much more performant. So Salesforce as standard will index for you the name, the ID, the record type ID, created date, last modified date, any foreign key fields, so account ID on contact is a good example, so any relationship fields, and for the lead and the contact objects only, it will also index the email field. For custom fields, Salesforce also automatically index for you any external IDs, any unique fields, so auto numbers, for example, or fields marked as uniques, and you can request to add your own custom indexes. So if you're working on a large deployment, big data volumes, and you're going to be running reports against it, or you're going to be running queries through Apex against this particular filter, contact your Salesforce support team or your Salesforce AE, ask them to help you in getting a index put on that field. And that can have quite a dramatic implication in terms of how fast your reports run as well. There's a link here to one of the many great cheat sheets Salesforce provides. So if you ever go to any of the Salesforce events, a world tour event, Dreamforce, anything like that, if you go to a developer group, try and get your developer group leader to come with some of these. You can get very, very nice laminated copies of the Salesforce cheat sheets, which are just invaluable for you to work with. Here's a link to the PDF copy of the query and search optimization cheat sheet. It's a fantastic resource. It explains for you how Salesforce does their filtering, how Salesforce comes up with the criteria for it to work with in deciding what's going to be the quickest way to run the query. That said, they can only do so much. Unlike one of the trade-offs of working on a fantastically managed platform as a service like Salesforce is that you don't have the same grab-on level of detail that you do with, say, working with your own Postgres database. So there are going to be some performance implications anyway, but you can minimize those by writing your queries in a more effective and a more well-written manner to try and minimize the amount of data and maximize the amount of filters you use. Maximize the number of indexes you use. Second thing we're going to talk about is looping. So loops are a way of just consuming resources. So every time you run a loop, if you're running for 10,000, if you're running for 15,000 items in your collection, you're just burning through CPU time. So Salesforce has, as it's a multi-tenant platform, it has a governor limit of 10 milliseconds for regular Apex methods that can run on it. 10 seconds, not 10 milliseconds. And that means that you have a limited amount of time to get anything done. When you write your loops, you have to be very careful about the way in which you instantiate and call your loop. So first of all, recursive loops are bad. Try and avoid those. They are a massive performance drain. But second of all, when you're writing your loops, if you instantiate it in the second way that's shown here by having a secondary variable j that is initialized to be the size of the collection, your loop will run much, much faster. There's a link down here to some of the force.comcast videos I've done on looping, where we show that you could effectively remove around 95% of the CPU time that was being taken in your loops by just structuring them differently. And this was for a large volume of data, but it's still a very, very big performance gain. So if you can just go through your loops, see if you can tweak them, see if you can change them, and see if you can even save, I don't know, 20% of your governor CPU time, 10% of your governor CPU time. That's 10% less that your user is waiting. And when it comes to something like this, big use of loops is for wrapper objects. So on a Visualforce page, that page we had there, so where we have a list of contacts, we might have a checkbox next to all of the contacts, and we can select some and then have another button, which is an email button that will allow us to go and email a bunch of the users that, email a bunch of the contacts we've selected. That loop to, first of all, put all of the contacts into this wrapper object, and then the other loop, when we come back, to loop through all those contact wrapper objects to retrieve the ones that have been selected. That can be an expensive Apex function to run, especially in a larger list, and it can really slow your page down. So it's something you've got to be aware of, something I highly encourage you to look at the video. It saved me a lot of time on the platform as well. And I know from a personal experience, when I was working on my Dreamforce presentation, it meant that I could do much larger volumes of data. So yeah, very worthwhile reviewing how you write your loops. So we're now going to talk about expensive code as well. So there are certain items that are more expensive than others do on the platform. And when I say expensive, I don't mean that they just take more time to run because of them doing something complicated. So doing something like JSON serialization and deserialization, yeah, that's more expensive than instantiating a string variable. Pretty much because deserializing JSON requires there to be some parsing and logic done in the background. When I'm talking about expensive code here, I mean code that can pull off lots of other pieces that can take a long time to run in the background without you realizing it. So for example, a DML statement, whenever you call a DML statement, it will go away and fire the related trigger if there is one. It will call the related workflow rules. So if your trigger, excuse me, then goes away and updates another 10, 20, 30 records, which is not uncommon in some situations. So it might be you have An opportunity, when your opportunity is updated to closed, you have a trigger that goes away, creates an invoice for the sales, it creates purchase order to send out, it creates a project for you to start working on. There's 3 objects that we've just thought of off the top of our heads, where the trigger will then go and create those objects, and the triggers on those objects will then fire. And all of these triggers firing in the background can just require your user to have to wait a little bit longer. So whenever you're doing DML, first of all, make sure your triggers are written in a way that are bulkified, that make themselves run faster. So again, look at looping through records and things like that. But also try and just batch together your DML, because it will just mean that you're only calling the trigger once rather than having to call it multiple times. Similarly with workflow rules, just have a look through your workflow rules, see which ones you're using. Often you can't remove them, you can't remove the need for them, that's fine, but just by calling the DML a small number of times, you will save time and you will improve the performance of your pages. The other piece we were talking about is callouts. So calling out to a web service, you're at the whim of the other web service. So if I call out to a Google web service, I'm fairly confident that Google will return quickly to me, because Google themselves have a massive cloud infrastructure that allows them to be low latency. If I call out to an integration to an existing enterprise system that might be stored in-house for my user, I might have to go through a firewall, I might have to have a separate authentication step, and truth be told, their server sat in the corner of their IT office somewhere is unlikely to be returning things very, very quickly and effectively. So when you make callouts, you should be aware that they can slow down your system quite dramatically. So if you're going to make a callout, you need to think about the ways in which you invoke it. Do you make the callout using a future method and return the data and have it stored in an object and have a streaming API request come to your page to retrieve it? Do you, in fact, make your web service callout from JavaScript? This might make it easier and quicker for you. So those are just items that can slow your page down dramatically, and just especially things that you're not always in control of. So we've gone through now the different areas of standard pages, of standard Visualforce pages, of how they can be affected by different parts of performance. Hopefully you found some good tips in there, and it's made you think about the different areas that can impact the speed of your application. We're now going to talk about asynchronous pages. So asynchronous pages allow a different dynamic for the user to interact with them. So when we have a page that works synchronously, like a standard Visualforce page that uses the Ajax re-render loop we were talking about earlier and the normal get postback loop that we were discussing, you can fire off a request, it'll go away and work on the server, and then it will come back, and you have to wait some time, and then you can fire off another request, possibly to another server, and you can have that wait and come back. With an asynchronous page, everything's done using callbacks or using web service callouts, and you can just have all these different events fire off without having to have the page sit and wait, and they can return in any order. So it allows you to have very quick, very effective pages that, although there's still a wait time, it might be a far reduced wait time, but also the page is still responsive. You don't have to re-render the page every time it comes back. You just update certain elements in it. So the way in which Salesforce has delivered some fantastic functionality to allow you to do this is Visualforce Remote Objects. So Visualforce Remote Objects, I think they were 2 releases ago. I'm afraid Salesforce releases tend to blur into one for me after so many years of having them. Yeah, they're a fantastic piece of kit that allow you to use these markup tags to define a remote object model that you want to be able to access via JavaScript on your page. And then you can just call some JavaScript methods to allow you to interact with the data, to do all your normal CRUD operations, and to just really work with your data in a nice, simple fashion. The way in which I like to think about them, and this was stolen from Peter Chittum, who did a fantastic presentation for me on this, is that they're like the standard standard controller for JavaScript. So it's a very, very nice way of thinking about it. It's a standard controller for you to use in JavaScript to allow you to have these interactive pages, these nice lean pages that don't have to have the post-back look going on. So it's worth just differentiating quickly the difference between JavaScript Remoting and JavaScript Remote Objects. Visualforce Remote Objects. JavaScript Remoting allows you to call an Apex method that's in an Apex class from JavaScript directly. So there's no need to call a web service, there's no API, and there's no Viewstate for you to worry about. So you can have a class that's got a method you want to handle, you want to call in it, and JavaScript can do that straight away. It doesn't need a Viewstate, as I mentioned, but what it does require you to do is handle the callback function and to then do something with the data. Whenever you use JavaScript Remoting, and the same for Visualforce Remoting, as we'll see in a minute, you have to do some more work and you have to write some more code for JavaScript rather than having to write Apex code. And you know what? You will find far more developers and designers that know JavaScript for you to make it easy for your page to work. It's very, very simple and effective, and Visualforce Remote Objects have the same advantages as the remoting side, except there's no need to write any Apex. So to do your create, your read, your update, and your delete, you just write some JavaScript. You just have a small method that calls off in the background, and it will retrieve the data for you. And you can have very, very complicated data models that work with this. So it's really, really effective. It's a fantastic tool. I recommend you go and have a look. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go through our existing page and we're going to look at it. Except this time, it's going to be using remote objects. So if I just refresh the developer console because I've been talking for too long. So first thing you'll notice about this Advanced Visualforce Remote Objects page is there is no controller. So we've not got to worry about having a controller. There's no Apex that's going to be running in the background. So we're going to have the controller loop lifecycle we were mentioning earlier. I've got some styles here that I'm just using because I'm not using the standard Apex tags. And then what we've got here is our remote objects. And these are the same same 6 lines of code, 7 lines of code that we saw a second ago. So all I'm defining is an account model, and I can add a JavaScript shorthand if I wanted to here. So if I'm working with a custom object, so for example, warehouse underscore inventory _C, I could provide a JS shorthand. So if I wanted to just put JS shorthand, and then I could put in a string that might be account. I'm not going to do that here as I don't need to because account's nice and easy anyway. And then we define the fields we want to use. You can also define remote object fields again. Because I'm using all standard fields bar one, I've just used the standard names. But if you want to provide shorthands to allow you to do that, again, you can do so. It's really, really nice, really flexible. And then we've also done the same for the account. And that's all we've needed to do to set up our data model. That's going to work for us now. So we can close that down. I've now got an Apex section header that is the same as I've taken before. And I've got a page block just to add some basic styling. And instead of the command button that I had on the previous pages, I have a standard input button now. And on click, I'm going to call a JavaScript function retrieve information. And that's going to pass in the value from the ACName input text area, which is here. And so rather than putting in an account ID via the lookup field, because that would have needed a controller, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type in the name of the account. I know that I'm searching for Edge Communications. You could build your own component that would allow you to do some sort of lookup, but I'm just going to use this because my users can type in what they are looking for. We've then just got some page block sections here and some section items, and all this is doing is just providing a basic layout for us. And I've got some divs that just happen to have the field names in them. And I've got a table at the bottom that's got my contact directory in. So it's exactly the same page pretty much as we had before, except that rather than having Apex output labels here and Apex pieces, I've just got standard HTML. I then got my script. Now notice that I've put this at the bottom of the page. I mentioned earlier on, if you're putting JavaScript in pages, try and move it to the bottom. It'll make the pages load faster and render faster for you. If you are looking for more JavaScript tips, I would recommend the Code School video series. There's some great information on there as well. And there's also probably about 100,000 blog posts out there on JavaScript performance. So the first thing we've got here is a variable to store some information that we're labeling start. I'm going to show you how quick this page is by storing the start time and the end time when we press the button, so we can see how quick it loads. So when I call the retrieve information function, just standard JavaScript, store the time, I'm going to get the account. So I'm going to create a variable called ac, and that's just going to have a new account SObject model from what I defined above. That's really, really easy for me to work with. So one line of JavaScript, I have my variable, and then I can call the retrieve method where I can pass in effectively a series of parameters to build up a query. So I'm going to do it where the name of my account is equal to the name variable that I passed in. I'm also going to limit it to excuse me, a single account because I've only entered one name. And then I've got a callback function. I'm going to handle the error by alerting it. Obviously, you'd handle the error better in production code. But what I'm going to do is the retrieved records will be an array for me. I'm going to get the first item off the array, put that in my account variable here, and then I'm just going to go through all the different document elements, and I'm going to put the correct value in there. And I'm just going to use, to do that, I just use the get method, put in a field name, and it will retrieve it from the account record object for me. I'm then going to call another method, which is load contacts. You can see here that I'm doing callback chaining. So that's a nice way of allowing you to work with this. So if you want to do complicated object models where you're calling one piece and calling another using data, you can do that. It's just standard JavaScript. So the load contacts function does pretty much the same as we did a minute ago. It has an account ID that it takes in, creates a contacts variable that uses the SObject model contact object, and then it's going to retrieve all the contacts where the account ID is equal to that account ID. I'm not going to limit it this time. It's going to get my records back, and then I'm going to loop through the records and just put them into that contact list, which is the table. And finally, I'm going to take the end time and log that out for me. So it's a very, very simple page. You can see the 130 odd lines. Most of that, excuse me, most of that is actually me just making it styled so that when we open up the page here, it doesn't look a million miles away from our previous advanced Visualforce pages. Okay, they look similar enough. You could spend a bit more time styling them, but that's not my forte. So what we're going to do now is enter Edge Communications as the account name, and I'm going to hit retrieve, and it's going to go away and retrieve that data for me. You'll notice the page didn't re-render. System just got the data and populated it using the JavaScript. And if I open up my console now, you can see it took 0.714 seconds to do all that. So really less than the blink of an eye. Very, very quick, less than a second for it to go away, retrieve the data, parse it out, and put it on the page. So it's a really quick and really effective way of allowing you to build these pages that are interactive, are fast, but the page could have still been responsive, so I could have hit that button and done some other action while that was going on in the background. Sadly, with 0.7 seconds, I'm not that quick, I couldn't have hit another button. So that's the end of the content for today's webinar. I hope you've found it useful. Before I go into a Q&A session, I'd like to just remind you about Trailhead, which is a brand new learning platform from Salesforce, and there's some fantastic interactive paths on there that you can go through, some great information that allow you to learn different parts of Apex programming, different parts of Force.com development, so I really recommend you check that out. The team that have been working on that have done some fantastic work on it, so it's very, very good. There is also some great online tutorials that are out there for free. There is the app builders information on Udacity, or Udacity, and then there's also, for experienced app developers, the developer workshop fast track tutorial. You can find that link there. Importantly, there's the feedback link. So, as I mentioned at the start, I don't work for Salesforce. Salesforce organize and run these webinars. People like myself give their time to go in and do the webinars. If you have any feedback, positive, negative, or otherwise, please do provide it. It helps to make these webinars successful and helps to improve them going forward. And that's it. So you can see my information there. If you want to contact me, if you want to follow the Force.comcast links, or if you want to fill out the survey. And I'm now going to have a look at some of the questions that we have available. So if we have a look 1 second. So Emily has asked, is there a link to all the static resources Salesforce offers? If you go to developer.salesforce.com, there's the library there. All of the materials are on there. You can find all of the different pages, all of the different PDFs that I mentioned. All that information is available for you, so you can download them and print them off. Or, as I say, if you go to a developer group, ask the developer group leader if he can get hold of some laminated copies, or attend one of the fantastic Salesforce conferences and you'll get some information there. What else have we got? Can I share the code with us? Rahul has asked that. As we mentioned, so if you go to the link that I had earlier, so if you go to the force.comcast Twitter handle, you'll see that there's the list of all the videos there. If you go through, have a look, you'll be able to see any code for going through the loops that I mentioned, all of the other code for the pages, and that'll be included and sent out when I upload, when this webinar is uploaded and sent out to you. So you'll get it in a week or two. And the same answer for Mohammed, who has asked about getting the remote object code. The Salesforce documentation around remote objects is really, really powerful and really, really helpful. So there's a lot of good information on there if you want to find out more as well. So yeah, please don't feel you have to wait around for this. There's also a very good webinar that is available for you to view now, I think, which was done about a month ago on JavaScript integration with Visualforce, where they go through not only some of the remote object stuff I've done today, but also integrating frameworks like AngularJS. It's a really, really good webinar. Highly recommend you go and look at it. Someone has asked, Bart has asked here correctly, should the JavaScript in the demo not be stored in a static resource? Bart, you are spot on. It should be stored in a static resource. I have done it on the page, however, because opening a static resource would have been a slightly clunkier demo. But yes, if I were to release this to a production environment, it would be in a static resource for us. So I've been asked here by Naga, what are the 5 best practices in Apex classes and Visualforce pages? I would say that coming up with 5 best practices is a very limiting thing to go through. If you have a look on the developer.salesforce.com website, there are a series of different white papers and documentation that have been written. One of them is Visualforce best practices, I know for definite. Myself and a lot of the other MVPs have many blog posts out there about different best practices. For myself, it would be make sure that your pages are nice and lightweight where possible. Try and reduce the amount of controller code you use. Obviously have fast queries using good indexes. Write lots of unit tests is a big one. And also, wherever possible, use declarative items. That's the biggest Apex and Visualforce tip that you can give. Wherever possible, use point and click. It makes it a lot easier, a lot more maintainable. So I've been asked here as well, if I select one dependent pick list and if I change another, will the first pick list have any effect? So I think this is referring to one of the comments I made at the start about having some information that you might want as part of the view state. If you have selective re-renders, you can define certain elements on your page to be re-rendered upon action functions firing. So if you have a look at the re-render attribute on something like action function or command button and command link, I believe it's on as well, then you'll be able to see that you can re-render just specific elements or areas of a page without having to re-render the entire page. However, the entire view state is sent back and forward. Someone would like the link for the new app developer session. If I go back, I will leave that there for a minute for you to pick up if you want to grab it off of the page. If not, when this is posted up, you can find it. Again, someone has asked about the demo code shown in this session. It'll be posted up along with a recording in about a week or so's time.
Not to interject, Paul, I usually don't, but I've been actually posting these questions in the chat window. So check out that too as well. All the links are in there. I've been posting away. So if you go scroll down to the app, you'll see them in the chat window. Sorry to chime in, Paul, but I thought I'd just help out there. This is your webinar host, so I'm just going to go mute now. So hopefully that helps everybody.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Sonia, for setting that, telling us that. Why did I make the account object and list contact as transient in my example and not the other contact object? I made only those two transient because they were the only two that I didn't need as part of the refresh cycle. The contact record, although it is changing in between all the cycles, I could have marked it as transient, but it would have given me a very empty, well, it would have given me no information on the controller, and so it would have been much harder to show you in the demo the implication that had. So again, it's an area you can go forward and further study and mark yourself. But as part of the demonstration, in order to show you that there was a reduction in the view state on the controller, I have to have some view state on the controller. Someone has asked, can they use JavaScript to call the bulk APIs, and where can they find the resources? If you go onto the developer.salesforce.com website, there are all the resources on there for you to find out everything around the different APIs. I have nothing in the top of my head that makes me think you shouldn't be able to call the bulk API from JavaScript. I would request that you consider why you might need to call the bulk API from JavaScript first, would be my actual question. But if you want to look at that further, you can do, as I say, developer.salesforce.com, and there's a fantastic workbook there that gives you all the information for authenticating and working with it. So can I elaborate on the difference between returning null for a page reference method type versus using void as the method type? So when I was doing the function calls, I was returning a page reference that was null rather than returning void. They have exactly the same effect. I personally return a null page reference because, truth be told, A, it was the way I was taught Apex, so it's a hangover from the first place I learned to develop Salesforce, and B, it also makes it, for me, easier in that I try and just see where the page references are coming out. To me, I am returning an empty page reference rather than returning nothing. It is just a personal preference. There's no real difference as far as I'm aware. Pat or Josh may have a big difference that they know of, but if they don't chime in saying otherwise, that's it's just down to my personal preference and the way I was taught. I have a lot of legacy hangovers like that. You'll find that most people, you could tell whether they did .NET or Java, depending upon how they put their curly braces, something like that. So where else have we got? So someone has asked here that I mentioned I discussed best practices for resources. Yes, it was just a single slide because the best practice for resources is to use static resources. I didn't feel it was worth having another slide and going through that information again for you. The long and short of it is, where possible, use a single zipped file static resource to store your information because it will be cached by Salesforce. It'll be cached on the user's browser, so they don't have to request it multiple times, and there's a long timeout on that cache. Salesforce are very good at making sure that it doesn't refresh just quickly, and so that there's a, as I said, there's a long timeout, so it's nice and easy for them to use. So yeah, I think that answers that question, and I think there's another question up here about how the caching is done. I believe it caches on your local browser in your browser's cache, and that just makes it nice and easy for the user so they don't have to request it multiple times. Someone has asked if they can display the data pulled via a remote object in Visualforce components. I don't believe you can because it requires a binding to something that's within the view state and something that comes down from the controller. So not necessarily within the view state, but it needs binding to a property that's stored on a controller. As we don't have a controller, you shouldn't be able to bind it to an Apex element like that. Someone has asked to discuss more how to use DML statements in Visualforce pages to improve performance. So the best way to improve performance for DML statements around Visualforce pages is to batch them together. So if you're doing the creation of 2 or 3 different records, try doing a single DML upsert statement that will take care of it rather than doing 3 different DML statements. If you're going through and doing a wizard where you're entering information, try and manage the DML statements quickly and easily so that if someone goes away from the wizard or goes off of the page, you've not got to worry about deleting those records again. So it's very, very quick and easy for you. So basically, try and reduce the amount of DML you're doing each individual time, and also for your triggers and those items that are affected by calling DML, try and make them run quickly and effectively as well for you. Someone has asked, Bala has asked, what is the order of execution for a Visualforce page? This is, in fact, a question that you get asked, or an area that you need to learn up on for the Advanced Developer exam. So rather than me try and remember it off the top of my head, I will point you to, again, the developer.salesforce.com website. There's a fantastic page there that I know I went through a number of times that will tell you the exact execution order of a Visualforce page for both GET requests and POST requests. And yeah, it's something that I can say for definitely you should go and look at and bookmark. And someone has in fact posted that up there. Let me just see if I can show it out in the chat window. Thank you very much, Curtis, for finding the exact page I was looking for. Okay, I think that's all the time we've got, and we're going to have to wrap up. So all that's left to say is please do go and fill out the survey, and thank you very much for attending the webinar. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you've learned something from it.